Ethereal music plays softly, as title appears welcome to the shadows of understanding, where we confront perhaps the most baffling enigma of existence, consciousness itself. I am Professor Morgan, and in this 12th lecture of our series, we'll venture into the labyrinth of awareness that defines yet defies our very being. What is it that makes the symphony of neurons in your brain different from any other complex arrangement of matter in the universe? What transforms electrical impulses into the rich tapestry of your subjective experience? These questions have haunted the corridors of human thought since we first became aware that we are aware. Consider this: the redness of a rose, the sweetness of honey, the sharp sting of pain. These experiences are undeniably real to you, yet entirely invisible to any objective measurement. This is the mystery we face. The enigma of consciousness lies not merely in its complexity, but in its very nature, subjective, internal, accessible only to the experiencer. How can something so fundamental to our existence remain so resistant to our most sophisticated tools of investigation? Today, we'll navigate this perplexing landscape, exploring theories that attempt to pierce the veil between the physical world and our inner experience. But before we venture further, we must acknowledge the elusive nature of consciousness itself. How do we define that which defies definition? Consciousness has been described as awareness, subjectivity, sentience, the feeling of what it is like to be something. Yet each definition seems to circle around the phenomenon rather than capture it directly. The very act of trying to examine consciousness objectively creates a paradox. We attempt to make the subjective objective, to externalize the inherently internal. Philosophers draw a critical distinction between types of consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness refers to the subjective, experiential aspect, the what it is like quality of experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain. Access consciousness, by contrast, concerns information available for reasoning, reporting, and behavioral control. This distinction illuminates our challenge. Science excels at explaining access consciousness through brain mechanisms, but phenomenal consciousness, that remains the true enigma. Throughout history, thinkers have offered various theoretical frameworks to explain consciousness. Dualism, most famously championed by René Descartes, proposes that mind and matter are fundamentally different substances. In this view, consciousness exists in a non-physical realm, interacting with the physical brain in ways that defy conventional physical laws. The immaterial mind, the ghost in the machine, becomes the vessel of conscious experience. But this separation creates as many questions as it answers. How does an immaterial mind interact with a physical brain? Where does this interaction occur? The pineal gland, as Descartes suggested. And how would we detect or measure this non-physical substance? Materialism offers a contrasting perspective, suggesting that consciousness is ultimately physical, emerging from the complexity of neural activity. In this view, there is no ghost in the machine. The machine itself, properly understood, generates consciousness. Some materialists argue that consciousness will eventually be reduced to neural mechanisms, while others suggest it emerges as a higher-level property, like how wetness emerges from H2O molecules that are not themselves wet. Yet materialism struggles to explain why any physical process, no matter how complex, should give rise to subjective experience at all. Why should arrangements of matter have an inner life? Panpsychism offers a radical alternative. Perhaps consciousness is not produced by certain arrangements of matter, but is a fundamental feature of reality itself. In this view, consciousness exists in some form everywhere, in all things, though perhaps in vastly simpler forms in simple systems. The philosopher Thomas Nagel famously asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" Panpsychism extends this question further. What is it like to be an electron, a photon, a quantum field? This enchanting perspective resolves certain problems, but creates others. If consciousness is everywhere, how does it combine into the unified experience that characterizes human awareness? Modern science has developed its own theories of consciousness. The integrated information theory suggests consciousness arises from complex systems that integrate information in certain ways, quantified as phi. The global workspace theory proposes that consciousness emerges when information is broadcast widely throughout the brain, becoming available to multiple processing systems. These theories provide testable hypotheses, yet they too face the haunting question: why should integration or broadcasting create subjective experience? And here we encounter what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. Why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience at all. The easy problems, Chalmers suggests, involve explaining cognitive functions and behaviors, how we discriminate stimuli, integrate information, report on mental states. These are complex but approachable through conventional scientific methods. But the hard problem, why any of these functions should be accompanied by experience, seems to resist conventional explanation. How does the water of brain chemistry transform into the wine of consciousness? Science has made remarkable progress in identifying neural correlates of consciousness, brain activities that correspond to conscious states. Certain patterns of activity in the prefrontal cortex, thalamus, and posterior cortical hot zone appear particularly important. Studies of patients in vegetative states, under anesthesia, or during sleep reveal shifting patterns that correlate with the presence or absence of conscious awareness. Yet correlation is not explanation. Observing that certain brain areas activate during conscious experience doesn't tell us why that activity is accompanied by subjective experience rather than happening in the dark. The mystery of consciousness ripples outward, touching fundamental questions about our nature. If consciousness emerges from physical processes governed by physical laws, what becomes of free will? Are our choices determined by neural firings we cannot control? What of personal identity? If consciousness is the stream of subjective experience, what happens when that stream is interrupted by dreamless sleep or anesthesia? Are we the same person when consciousness returns? And what of other minds? If consciousness is inherently subjective, how can we know with certainty that others experience it as we do? The possibility of philosophical zombies, beings physically identical to humans but lacking inner experience, haunts our assumptions. As we conclude our exploration, we find ourselves at the threshold of understanding, gazing into the abyss of a mystery that defines yet transcends us. Consciousness remains the bridge between the objective world of physics and the subjective world of experience. Perhaps, as some have suggested, consciousness represents a fundamental limit to our scientific understanding, not because of temporary gaps in knowledge, but because the very nature of consciousness may require new ways of thinking beyond our current conceptual frameworks. In our next lecture, we'll explore how this enigma shapes our understanding of personal identity and the self. Until then, I leave you with a question to contemplate. Could it be that consciousness is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived?